Well, thank you very much. So, just a point of introduction. I think it's self-evident from what you just heard. I'm not a specialist in science. I'm an English professor. So I don't know a lot about old Earth or young Earth, but I do know a bit about Middle Earth. So that's... Tolkien's one of my academic interests, but I teach Shakespeare and Milton. The Bible is literature, and Lewis and Tolkien, literary theory, those sorts of things. My expertise, it's in the title of the book that was announced on Romanticism, Early 19th Century Literature. Is it sort of a love-hate relationship? On the one hand, I think that they present a fantastic portrait of human nature. It's a poetic portrait of the origins of life and the connection that we have to the natural world. I think that's fantastic. On the other hand, I long concluded before I converted that it was totally irrational, and that as a thinking man, I could not see it as anything but false. And so I came to faith during the first year of my PhD over in England at the University of Durham. My problems with this field and this subject of Romanticism began long before that. I long thought Darwinism to be intellectually untenable, and that sense has only grown over time, but my studies were one of the reasons that I finally closed the door on it. And remember, I'm not a biologist or a geologist. I don't know about the fossils or the geology or the anthropology. But I can't see much in the way of signs of evolution as in evolutionary progress. Devolution, yes, that was talked about in the session, the breakout session. I see those things all around us, signs of entropy. Those are definitely there, but not progress. I think that the view of progress, which is in the Romantic period and is connected with nature and our union with nature, is obliterating human nature and human society around us, and it's presented in a literary theoretical form in the form of deconstruction. But I'll get that to in a minute, but I just think it's false. And I'm going to give you reasons why I think that it is false. And the first one is connected to my subject area. So the first reason is that because the portrait or the worldview, the poetic form of evolution preceded the scientific discovery. It's 40 or 60 years before Darwin's Origin of Species. His ancestor Erasmus Darwin wrote a poem that was more or less already presenting a theory of evolution. It's clear in that work that he is conceiving of evolution as Darwin presents it. But it's also in the poet John Keats's poems. He wrote a cosmogony. It's an epic of sorts called Hyperion, and I'm going to get that on the screen above us, and I'll read from it. As heaven and earth are fairer, fairer far than chaos and blank darkness, though once chiefs, and as we show beyond that heaven and earth in form and shape, compact and beautiful, in will, in action free, companionship, and thousand other signs of purer life, so on our heels a fresh perfection treads, a power more strong in beauty, born of us and fated to excel us, as we pass in glory that old darkness. This is a portrait of evolution in a poem that was written in the 18 teens. I think it was 1818, thereabouts. 40 years before Darwin writes Origin of Species. But if the scientific theory of evolutionary progress, now by the way, I'm not disputing adaptation or change, natural selection, genetic entropy, I think that sort of change is indisputable. But the idea of progress of species, or this jump from one species to the next, if it were based on science, we would expect that the myth celebrating the evolutionary progress would come after the scientific discovery and not before it. It would begin in the lab, or it would begin in the academy, or it would begin on the field of research, and it would be disputed by other scientists. And only after that time, then it would be passed on to the popular imagination, and poems would be written about it. But that's not what we find. So just empirically speaking, I don't purport to be a scientist, but if we're going to talk about that, you would expect that a scientific theory would begin as a scientific theory, not a poetic vision, which is attempting to provide a mythic alternative to the Christian faith, which is what Keats was doing, by the way. It's plain from his letters that he sought to create a myth that was more appealing than that of Christianity. I'll also add that the ideas surrounding the origin of language in Darwin's Origin of Species would not be found as they actually are found. That is 100 years before Darwin writes about the origin of language, and writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the German writer Johann Gottfried Herder. We wouldn't find that, but we do find it. The exact same views of language and the origins of language we find long, long before the scientist comes along and presents them as an observation of the way things are. And by the way, the famous 19th century scholar of Orientalist languages, a man by the name of Max Müller, he lampooned Darwin's view of the origin of human language. He called Darwin's idea that it imitated from animal sounds the bow wow theory. He called the idea that it began with instinctive cries, and when you say, oh, for surprise, and ouch for pain, he called that the poo-poo theory. He called Darwin's suggestion that words sounded like the sounds that things made, like words like whisper and crack and belch and squash, the ding-dong theory of language. These are all Darwin suggestions. He called the coos and the non-verbal cues that mothers make with their babies the mama theory. All of these are ways of mocking Darwin's view of how language originates. And he calls the idea that humans first used non-verbal signs and gestures to communicate before speaking, so-called gestural theory, the ta-ta theory. Ta-ta. So when Francis Collins calls genetics the language of God, which is the title of his new book, he's using a metaphor, of course. It's a very clever metaphor. I'm going to call it the tish-tosh theory. Because genetics is not the language of God. Jesus said that heaven and earth shall move with the times, but my words will not change with the times. My words shall not pass away. Heaven and earth may move, but my words shall not pass away. The real language of God is contained in words. And human beings who bear the image of God are distinguished by that distinctive power which only human beings possess, that is to use words in the way that God does, not to the same degree, but in a similar way. So Müller's conclusion, and this is the next slide, is the one that I'm going to maintain throughout here. Language is our Rubicon, and no brute will dare cross it. The science of language will yet enable us to withstand the extreme theories of evolutionists and to draw a hard and fast line between man and brute. Now, the Rubicon is that moment in Julius Caesar's life when he crossed into Italy with the army of Rome, and thereby civil war ensued. He crossed that. It was that Rubicon moment. He dared not do it. He did do it. No animal has yet developed the capacity for speech. And Müller says, and they never will. Now, that's my main contention. But implicated in it is my next concern about evolution. It calls itself a scientific theory, but it is fundamentally irrational. Fundamentally irrational. Now, we would expect that the theory would account for our reasoning powers. So let me explain here. When I say that it's irrational, I don't mean that it doesn't make sense, although it doesn't make sense. But that's not what I mean. And I don't mean that I just don't like it, although I don't like it. What I mean is that irrational in a far stronger sense, the theory of evolution, which is just a form of naturalism, actually precludes the possibility of reasoning. It absolutely precludes the possibility of reasoning. The special feature of words in human language and the capacity to understand things and reason about them and to articulate them and to get to the bottom of them, it doesn't matter to the theory of naturalism. In fact, it's impossible in naturalism. This is the great argument for reason that C.S. Lewis made in his work Miracles, if you're ever interested in looking at that a little further. Evolutionists want to claim that everything is explicable in terms of natural causes and natural causes alone. And that there's no need to appeal outside of that system to a supernatural cause, like the Christian doctrine of creation, that God created everything out of nothing, ex nihilo. They say that this is something that's not empirically observable and is totally unnecessary. We can't know that. All we know is nature. So nature explains everything for them. So it's a really strong claim. It's a really strong claim. Nature explains everything. So there's nothing, it's so strong that in my experience, those who espouse it are totally unreasonable in their approach to the discussion of the topic. They don't really want to discuss it. And they're not willing to entertain any other possibilities. Now, the most famous example of this is probably Richard Dawkins, who was the professor for public understanding of science from 1995 to 2008 at Oxford University. He was notoriously abusive towards anybody who disagreed with him on his subject matter. But remember, he's the professor for the public understanding of science. He wasn't actually a particularly well-known scientist. He was a publicizer. And so he made a living by doing what he did. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be that way. Francis Collin is a notable counterexample. I don't think that he's an abusive individual, and he holds to evolution as an evangelical Christian, is my understanding. I find that hard to believe, but it is true. But the reason I say that people tend towards being unwilling to even discuss the matter is because naturalism will not allow that they might be wrong on a single point, not one single point. They have to be dogmatic, and they have to insist that any other view than the naturalist view is unscientific. They have to do that. And the reason that they do that, and by the way, when they do that and they use the word unscientific, they don't use it scientifically. In other words, it hasn't passed by the empirical test of science. They haven't verified it by the means of empirical scientific verification when they use the word unscientific. They just call it unscientific. What they mean is it's not the way we think. So it's a term of description, but it's not actually a rational one or an explicable one or a defensible one. But it suggests that their opponents are irrational. And to prove that they are reasonable, they usually end up appealing to the scientific nature of their claim, the fact that they have PhDs, and the fact that evolution is science, which is an assertion and not a proof. Evolutionists do appeal to the evidence, and in fact, that's all they do, is that they point to the evidence. And they ignore the fact that all evidence needs to be interpreted. Evidence on its own does not do things. Now, we talked about that word hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is my thing, the science of interpretation. There is no such thing as evidence that speaks for itself. Evidence does not speak for itself. It never does. It needs to be interpreted. The evidence in Darwinism needs to be interpreted. They don't interpret it. They simply say, it fits evolution. That's their presupposition. It's also their confirmation bias. And there's no argument for it. Now, I call this the association of ideas. It's like beads on a necklace. There's this, and then there's this, and there's this, and then there's this. And they're connected because there's a thread of connection, but they don't actually make the thread. They don't make an argument for it. They simply assume it. And the reason that it is so is because they never appeal to the truth. Because truth is not a naturalistic phenomenon. Truth is actually a philosophical concept. And it's a transcendental concept. It appeals outside of science. But for them, there is no body of knowledge outside of science. So they don't appeal to truth. They say it's not a naturalistically observable thing, and it does not cohere to naturalism, so they don't actually speak about that. They just say that their opponents are unscientific, which means they don't agree with naturalism. So as I say, now this is rather confusing. It's a circular argument, but nonetheless. I am rather sympathetic having said that, because if you do hold to such a strong view, and I realize that there are probably some who don't hold it quite so strongly, but in general, evolutionists and naturalists hold to a very strong view of nature that won't allow anything outside the system. Because if they do, it destroys the whole argument about naturalism. If anything exists outside of it, the whole argument comes down. By the way, statistics are also not a proof of anything, actually. Statistics simply measure probability. So if you flipped a coin 1,000 times, I think the probability, would it be half of the time it would be heads and half the time, that would be the probability. And you could construct statistics from that, but it wouldn't tell you, it wouldn't really be anything other than probability. It wouldn't be science, it wouldn't be knowledge. It would be a measure of probability. But we tend to refer to stats as a scientific portrait of things. It's just it's a sloppy intellectual habit made by social scientists who also tend to be Darwinists, but don't have to be, but tend to be, increasingly so. But that appeal, by the way, of probability is insufficient for the naturalistic hypothesis. Everything must be calculable, everything must be coherent, absolutely. No room for chance, no room for randomness. As C.S. Lewis puts it, and this is the next slide, and this is the big problem, no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be real insight. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court. For that theory would itself have been reached by thinking. And if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound. A proof that there were no such thing as proofs, which is nonsense. So the only way for Darwinism to appear scientific is to make chance or randomness the consistent feature of the new science. They're consistent in the randomness. They're consistent in the inconsistency. They're consistent in the irrationality. So it appears irrational to its devotees because irrationality is the one consistent thing in the system. It's the irrational nature of nature which they're demonstrating in the way that they discuss the matter, because if they appealed to reason, they'd be appealing outside of naturalism, and it would be refute the whole system. So they do not allow for the concept of truth, empirical verification, truth and falsehood, the philosophical concept. They don't build it on a philosophical idea of the laws of logic. That doesn't bother them. Those aren't the tools of science. That's philosophy, they say. And they think that the science doesn't have to agree with philosophy. This is not true. They do have to agree with philosophy. Otherwise, they're not thinking. That's the issue. They do have to agree with philosophy. It has to conform with philosophical subject matter, and it has to agree with concepts of truth. But there's in Darwinistic naturalism, in particular the idea of progressive evolution, there is no causation, there is no contradiction, there's no need for logic. That is its consistency, that emphasis. Now, consistency is actually a mark of the truth. Consistency is a mark of the truth. So it has the appearance of truth. But it's also a mark of intellectual pathology. And that's what I think it is. So when I observe, and let me give you an illustration. When I observe that psychology is, I mean literally, by definition, it's the science of the psyche. The psyche logi. The logi here means the science or the knowledge of the psyche. I ask the question, what is the psyche? That's a good question, I think. Because if it really is a science, then we ought to be able to answer that question immediately. What is the psyche at the heart of psychology? We ought to be able to agree on that. Well, a few generations ago, psychologists would have said it was the mind. Or maybe the soul. Probably if they had religious background, they would have said the soul. Maybe even the emotions. That would have been what the psyche is that's being studied. Well, nowadays, the common response is that it's the brain. In fact, that is I think it's growing almost exponentially, the research into the area. So most psychologists now, at least in the academia, I'm not talking about practitioners, I'm talking about the research side of things, they're studying the brain. Now we can leave aside the fact that all the accredited experts here, And I think there are over 100 different schools of psychology which are recognized as having credibility, that they fundamentally disagree on the basic thing that they're studying. I'm not even going to discuss that as a matter to go down into, but I actually think that's rather problematic. But let's just deal with the latest manifestation. If the psyche is the brain, and the brain is the thing that thinks and the thing that causes us to think, then what is thinking? Because a brain is a material object, right? So what is thinking? The evolutionary psychologist who appeals to the brain as the source of thinking will say that, well, it's something like the product of brain chemistry. No? Your moods, your thoughts, no? Okay, well, we can be taken up on this. If it's something, but what is thinking then? I'd be curious to know. If that is so, then does that not make my belief a delusion? What is thinking? Is it epiphenomenology? Do I think that I'm thinking? But I'm not really thinking. Like, how would I know that I was thinking or not thinking? Because if the brain was the source of it, well, what is the psyche then exactly? I'm not quite sure. And so this is my problem. Thinking appears to me, by that account, epiphenomenology. Well, what do we do then with studies on the brain? They follow the scientific method, there's no doubt about that, and I think people that do this have a great deal of integrity in their approach. I have no doubt about that. But if the material brain is the thinking thing, the res cogitans, as Descartes calls it, isn't the scientific gesture just a sort of epiphenomena of a sub-rational process? Like, it's a biological thing. It's like I have a bad thought. Well, maybe I ate some bad food and it's now caused my brain to object. And so I have irrational thoughts at this point. I'm upset. I don't know exactly how it works, actually. I actually, by the way, I'm not disputing that there are brain scientists who are doing good work and that what the effect of this can be beneficial. I'm just saying that the appeal to evolutionary psychology for it is the problem. And the study of what exactly it is. They are using reasoning, by the way, but that doesn't fit with the evolutionary, that part of it. That's what I'm saying. Well, so it seems to me that Darwinian evolution is guilty nowadays, and that was just one example. I'm not saying that psychology it's just one illustration of it, is guilty of what Alfred North Whitehead described in the slide above. It's guilty of the same obscurantism that it used to accuse the church of and clergymen of. After all, we would expect that the theory of evolution would meet the standards of scientific verification. Next slide. But here's my question, and there are 5. Has anyone observed the phenomenon, that is evolution, as it occurred and recorded it? These would be standard in standards of scientific verification. Has anyone ever recorded this? Secondly, can other scientists replicate it? Because that's part of experimental science as well. Thirdly, can any of them come up with a set of facts that, if they were true, would contradict the theory? This is Karl Popper's test, the falsifiability test. Can any of them do that? Fourthly, can scientists make predictions based on evolution? What are we evolving towards? Can you answer me what that is? Fifthly, does it, that is evolution, illuminate something hitherto unknown or baffling in the areas of science? And it seems to me, and again, I'm not a scientist, but I think it's no, 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 and no. So I think North Whitehead, once again, next slide, is correct on this. But I do believe, having said all that, that this is a glorious myth. This is what my talk's about. This is a glorious myth. So I'm in agreement with C.S. Lewis on this, and he's no mean storyteller. I'm not the storyteller he is, but he is no mean storyteller. He calls the myth of evolutionary progress, this grand narrative, as one of the most moving and satisfying world dramas which has ever been imagined. This is from his essay called The Funeral of a Great Myth. By the way, he is doing the funeral oration over it, he thought. And I'm going to quote from this. Everything is moving upwards and onwards. Reason has evolved out of instinct, virtues out of complexes, poetry out of erotic howls and grunts, civilization out of savagery, the organic out of the inorganic, the solar system out of some sidereal soup or traffic block, and conversely, reason, virtue, art, and civilization as we now know it are only the crude or embryonic beginnings of far better things, perhaps deity itself, in the remote future. For in the myth, evolution, at least as the myth understands it, is the formula for all existence. To exist means to be moving from the status of almost zero to the status of almost infinity. To those brought up on the myth, nothing seems more normal, more natural, more plausible than that chaos should turn to order, death into life, ignorance into knowledge, end quote. And we are in the last, or the penultimate act of that drama today. When I say we, I'm talking about our culture more broadly, not talking about everyone in this room and not talking about myself per se. People in the past believed in God, in a higher power. These days, that is not only unfashionable, it's almost unthinkable. We are the true humanity, we're humanity perfected. Through technology, we've mastered nature in a way akin to demigods. So I can pick up my smartphone and through a FaceTime or something like that, I can look at somebody and talk to them in my time on the other side of the world instantly. This is a divine power. It's something like, it's extraordinary. Now, the view of this, when it's applied to human nature, and I do think that, so human nature being such as it is, we are conditioned by the tools that we use, as well as using the tools condition us. And so all of us are addicted to our smartphones. You think about them, can't put them down because they condition us, and the inventors of them are aware of this when they made them, by the way, as well. They're psychologically addictive. But transhumanism is the application of technology to human nature in order to perfect it. It's characteristic of this age, the penultimate age. So let me give you another illustration. Through eugenics, we ensure that only demigods are born now. No one who has a genetic defect will be born if we can help it. And if they are, we will find a way to get rid of them. Infanticide is being publicly discussed now. Not just abortion, you can abort before they come to life, but infanticide is actually on the discussion table. Euthanasia is also if you are not living to the standard of life that you would like to. Why? Is it because it's intolerable? Is it because the pain and suffering is unimaginable? There probably are such instances where it is that bad, but it's basically no if you feel it's not worth living. Why would you feel it wasn't worth living? Because the standard of human nature is now perfection. Anyone can end his life if he falls below that status of the way we see ourselves. It's also through applied psychology. We will ensure that no one suffers in a way that would demean his or her divinity by having them suffer in a state of depression or anxiety or mania. We will not allow that to happen. Applied psychology will prevent that from happening. We're going to prevent any form of suffering. Through applied economics, we will ensure that the demigods which we are will never suffer any material want. We will have everything we want. Through the social state, we will banish all inequality, which is the preeminent sign of the natural in our own human bodies. None of us are equal. None of us are alike. There is an inequality in every aspect of human nature. Every person is different, and every person is unique, and each of us is, none of us are equal, because if we were equal, we'd be exactly the same. That's the glory of human nature. The modern social state is committed to banishing that in the name of a perfected humanity. That's the penultimate act. The last act is the best. It's the most consequential. It's the feature of the very greatest of all myths. The Götterdämmerung. The great hero dies, the twilight of the gods. The great hero dies, King Arthur dies, Beowulf dies, Siegfried dies, Keats's gods die, just like the dusk which steals in like a thief in the night. And all the time that the myth of progress has advanced, and we're in that myth now, dispelling all doubt about the supremacy of their civilization, a restless malice has woken. a dragon has been disturbed. Sauron has returned to Mordor. Winter is coming. The sublime and the terrible power of nature man's old enemy thought to have been vanquished, put beneath our feet, has merely been gathering its strength for one final assault, and it's going to be a cataclysmic, crushing, insuperable defeat. We're going down. Doesn't matter whether it's through the cooling of the sun, a massive bacterial assault, or the latest edition, a climate catastrophe of epic or global proportions. It's going to bring all life to an end in an apocalyptic fashion. Apocalyptic. That's the last act in the cosmic drama, which is part of evolution, is the destruction of everything that was at its height. He sees it over and over, and it's in evolution as well. So this sense of the inevitability of death. And so there's a pursuit of excellence and a sense of nihilism that attends it. And there's nothing that characterizes the 20th century and the 21st century more than this oppressive sense of the meaninglessness of life and the drive towards death, whether through killing or taking our own life. And young people have a terrible sense that life is meaningless. This is part of the product of the myth of progress that they feel is leaving them behind because they are not those perfect beings that they are told that they ought to be, and they know that they're not. They can see it if they're on social media. Things aren't quite that good. That portrait of human nature, which is the portrait of progress, I can't meet that bar. So how then do we explain the potency of the myth? If it is a myth, how do we explain its potency? Well, C.S. Lewis, in his essay, The Funeral of a Great Myth, conjectures it might have something to do with our psychology. It might. He gives a couple of possible speculations. He says we have a tendency to denigrate everything that's respectable. He might have said Christian. And to flatter all disreputable things. So, for example, on the one hand, if we're cynics, we might debunk things like love as just a species or a sugar-coated version of lust. You know, love is really just lust. It's merely lust. We give it a nice fancy word, but it's just lust. Virtue it's a survival instinct. There's no real good. There's no real evil. There's no real good. It's a survival instinct. So is charity, altruism. These are survival instincts. So we can denigrate truly good things. On the other hand, if we wish to exalt ourselves, we can flip it around and we can say that all the bad things that we note are just the early stages of better things. We're evolving after all. So sins and vices and predispositions towards horrible things like sadism, deliberate cruelty to others, or masochism towards ourselves, they're not really sins, and there's nothing really wrong with that. If we take a more tolerant perspective, a more educated vantage point, these are just forms of self-expression, forms of love even. So it's not good and evil, it's not black and white, it's 50 Shades of Grey. Do you know the chief consumers of that book, 50 Shades of Grey, are mothers in their 30s with children? It's called mummy porn. Why on earth are mothers in their 30s reading 50 Shades of Grey? Like, what's going on there? This is extraordinary. I'm going to get into that. Two other benefits, and these are his conjectures. I'll add to them a little bit, but it has an economic advantage. He says that we no longer want or expect things to last. There was once a time that we thought that if it's built to last, Ford tough, that's good. It lasts. Now we expect things to become obsolete. We're not angry when they don't work after a few years because we know that something better is coming. And as a result, and we'll think that the newest thing's always best. So your iPhone, the newest iPhone's the best iPhone. The other one that you got 5 years ago for $1,000, it's a brick. That's okay, the new one's better. That thing is applied to everything. So whatever is newest is the best thing. A new house is better than an old house. A new car better than an old car. You can't fix the new car, and it'll cost you twice as much to fix it, but it's better than the old car. Well, I'm not sure it is necessarily, but that's the view. So it sells things. One suggestion he makes. It also invites the door to transhumanism, as I said. We can make ourselves something that can be improved. We can add to it. We can do experiments on people. We can test if it will do them if it will make them better. Now, if it does them damage, we can look away from that, but because we believe in progress, because we know progress will come, and we can just discount the damage, the good thing is going to come. And at the same point, we can commodify people, and we can make money off people. And if it's damaged, well, that's unfortunate, but it's going to get better. We know that because of evolution, he says. Okay. Final point, and I think this is compelling as well. He says it advances revolutionary politics. Keats writes after the French Revolution. Darwin is still part of the revolutionary age. It's still happening in Europe. And there's a reaction or revolutionary politics which depends on this idea that what is newest is best. And progress comes from changing things the way they are. Now, if evolution were simply change, if it were just change, it would admit that things could get worse as well as better, if it were simply that. And evolution in one sense is that. When it is that, then that's okay. But as soon as we say that evolution is progress, and that is what it is in the popular imagination, we will ignore that we might lose something in the process of the change. We'll ignore that. In fact, if we really believe it, we'll be willing to discount any evidence. We'll be willing to risk anything because we will assume and expect that things will got better simply by virtue of the fact that it's in the future and it's changed, so it must be better. Whereas if we thought it was just change and it could go either way, we would never put at risk the things essential to our lives. So our own human nature, the nature of the family, civil liberties, social structures. I could go on and on. We would never even question those. But if we are true believers in progress, we will change absolutely everything, believing that whatever the cost, it's worth it because we're moving to something better and better. And governments that are committed to revolutionary politics will advance those things. And I think that that is an empirically verifiable observation that that is exactly what happens. So, but of course, if we are convinced that change necessarily entails progress, if we're true believers in the myth, we'll expect that it's going to be good. Now, the atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel says this, next slide. This one's really interesting. That the idea of intelligence design has done a great service by bursting the bubble of evolution, which has become more like a religion than anything else, and a religion that is held precisely because it opposes traditional belief. But I can't accept that, and I don't think that anyone who is thinking clearly about it can accept this mythology of science, this idea of human progress through change, precisely because it denies the power of reason, it doesn't meet the standards of scientific verification, it commits us to an absurd, inevitable idea of human progress, and above all, it fails to account for our unique human capacity. The one thing, well, besides pride, idolatry, envy, greed, lust, exploitation, self-contradiction, perversion, and self-deception, besides those things which are true of human nature, the one thing that distinguishes us is our capacity for speech. The thing about Darwinian science is that, and the first speaker talked about this, and I thought it was quite powerful and very true. Understanding what something is for makes sense of what it is. You have to know what something is for. What's the tool for? Darwinian science uses the tool of science to hammer and bash out every distinct feature of human nature, to make it like the rest of nature, to accord with naturalism. It bashes it down. And it does it even in the use of language, while at the same time having no explanation for what language actually is, as evolutionists now admit. Next slide. This is a fatal blow. 8 eminent evolutionary thinkers, including Noam Chomsky, the linguistics guru, the guru in linguistics over the last 50 years, says this: understanding the evolution of language requires evidence regarding origins and processes that led to change. In the last 40 years, there's been an explosion of research on this problem, as well as a sense a sense that considerable progress has been made. We argue instead that the richness of ideas is accompanied by a poverty of evidence, with essentially no explanation of how and why our linguistic computations and representations evolved. Now, I don't know if the implications have dawned on these gentlemen. Even the eminent psychologist Jordan Peterson still holds the evolutionary psychology, a man I admire greatly. But evolution has no account for the distinctive characteristic of human beings, their capacity to speak and to understand through speech, to understand the nature of things. Once again, as Max Muller put it, language is our Rubicon, and no brute will dare pass it. The science of language will yet enable us to withstand the extreme theories of evolutionists and to draw a hard and fast line between man and brute. Why will it do that? Why does he have this belief in it? It's because he has a certain understanding of what language is. And that language that he has convictions about is my conviction. It comes from Scripture. Next slide, please. How will we answer this? Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and everything that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds, every living thing." This word for word here in Hebrew is davar. The word davar in Hebrew means two things. It does mean word, but it also means an event. Our English word doesn't have that sense, but it does in Hebrew. We can see it as it's used here. When God speaks, something happens. He says, "Let there be light," and there's light. He says, "Let the earth, the sky be separated from the land," and it was so, and so forth. So he speaks and an action happens. Every time God speaks, an action happens. And it's the defining characteristic of the biblical God. The idols around Israel do not speak. They're dumb. They're mute. They can't speak. But he speaks. When he speaks, things happen. Another thing to notice about this account. Second thing, he speaks everything into being, including human beings, but he doesn't speak to everything. He only speaks to one thing. And the one thing isn't a thing, it's person. It's the human person. You speak to a person when you assume that the person has the ability to understand you. In other words, rationality. They have the capacity to understand, to respond. That makes them responsible. Therefore, there's a moral awareness and an accountability to God that goes with it, which is expressed in the dominion mandate, which is in verse 28. Have dominion over. And how will they have dominion over it? It will be not only by being shepherds, it will be an intellectual mastery, and they will use it to be good stewards and so forth. Now that's there. God says that of them, to them, and they have the same capacity. They will name the animals, etc. Let me move on to the second slide. Second text. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, the Hebrew word for word was davar. The Greek word for word is logos. Logos also means word, but it means something else that's not quite the same there in the Hebrew. It means the functional principle of all things. So, an illustration, the combustion in the engine of your car is the logos of the car. It allows the automobile, the auto, to be mobile. It's what moves it. It's that functioning thing that makes it function. That's the logos. And it says that Jesus, who is the Word of God, made all things. So they bear his mark and his character. That means that those who understand God, namely human beings, are able to understand. And they're commanded to do so because it's part of the dominion mandate. So it's the scientific mandate. Understand things. No longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, which is naturalism, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds. In accordance with, now we are made in the image of God. Jesus, Colossians 1, verse 15, is the image of God. We're in the image of God. He is the image of God. To be transformed into the image of God, and his likeness is to follow his pattern of dominion over the world. Well, what does that look like? Well, it is genuine, real understanding. It's also care and compassion for things that are less than him. There is a categorical distinction between God and the animals and the natural world, and human beings and the natural world. But nonetheless, we're to take care of them. It's part of our dominion mandate. It's also part of bearing the image of God. It's genuine science. Darwinism reduces us to a natural product, and it's an irrational thing. Let me conclude with that, with a word of prayer, and then we'll take questions. Yes? Okay. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for this opportunity to speak about knowledge and about myth and about truth above all. We thank you that your word is truth. We thank you that your word separates truth from falsehood. It takes captive strongholds of the enemy. We pray, Lord, that as we leave here, that we will be stimulated not only in the thoughts of our minds, the feelings of our hearts, and the words on our lips, but we pray, Lord, that we would praise you in all things. For that is the reason for which we were made, the purpose of life. Bless us, Lord, as we discuss these things, and as we praise your name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Questions? And how is this will work? Okay. So I will just point to you, and then I will have to repeat the question for the sake of the camera. So if you have any questions, observations, please do ask, and then we'll go from there. Yes?
So you said Francis Collins claims to be an evangelical Christian, but also a firm believer of evolution.
He's the author of the Human Genome and all that, yeah. You know who he is, right? Yeah.
So do you think it is possible for a born-again Christian who believes in the inerrancy of Scripture to also accept entirely the theory of evolution?
No. So I think he's wrong. And I think that the consequence of that belief is seriously problematic. But I don't doubt that because I have no access into the man's heart, but I think he's serious when he says that he professes faith in Christ. I don't doubt that. I've never met him, obviously. But I do think there's a serious contradiction in holding that with that, yeah. Okay? Sorry, I didn't repeat the question. But I'll do that next time. Yes, hi.
Dr. Madison, do you have a list of all the books that you have written? Because the other people have them, and we can find out if they're in the store?
They're not in the store, I don't think, as far as I know. As I say, I'm a professor of literature. I write about things like literary theory. I do have a website now, which has videos on it and radio clips and debates and some things I've written, but they tend to be on matters of English literature. Okay, so scottmasson.ca. That one's tough. As long as you get my name right. 2 T's and 2 S's.
Yes.
Still being built more or less, but I think it's up there. So there's some stuff up there on this.
2 T's and Scott and 2 S's and Masson or Mason?
Masson. Thank you. www. scottmasson.ca.
Okay, and then
.ca. I should write on this. Yes?
So evolution makes no distinction between animal and a human.
Oh, I think it makes a distinction between them.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. So evolution makes no distinction between a human and an animal. I think it does make a distinction. I just think it sees them as part of the same species. There's an origin, and I don't think it sees a categorical distinction. There's no divide in kind, because I don't think there's an allowance for that. They're all part of nature. It's the evolution of the species. One leads to the next thing. So there's a distinction in that sense, but they're fundamentally the same thing, just changing. It's all just change. It's not even a hierarchical change per se, or ought not to be. But it is, yeah, that's my understanding of it. Yes, sir.
What is a neo-Darwinist?
A neo-Darwinist. Oh, gosh.
What's the difference?
I'm not sure there's a huge difference myself. I think that they would disagree, but I think they hold more or less to the Darwinian positions of old. There are certain features of Darwinism as it was presented which needed to be tidied up a little bit, but they've more or less held to the same thesis. But I'm no expert on this. You should ask one of the other speakers on that front. I'm not exactly sure myself. Or if I once knew, which I think I did, I've forgotten. Yeah. Yes?
What books would you recommend that would sort of push this forward?
On this topic that I've just talked about.
Yeah. Repeat the question.
What books would I recommend on this topic, the mythology of science that I've just talked about? So, I've referred to C.S. Lewis a few times. His book on miracles is quite interesting because he's accounting for the supernatural in the face of the dominant worldview of his day, which is naturalism, and he sees evolution as a species of naturalism. So I think it's a very helpful book on that front. It's not only about miracles, it's about the worldview of naturalism. The Funeral of a Great Myth by him is also a good book. A more popular account, which I've got some material from for this talk, is by Tom Wolfe, and I think it's called The Empire of Speech? Kingdom of Speech. It's very witty. Yeah, it's clever. And it's quite well argued, but it's more witty than anything. Yeah. And he makes observations of this nature, and some of the quotes I've just grabbed from it because I thought, money quote, that's good. I like that. It's always best when you let people speak for themselves and let their own conclusions come forth, right? So you're not misrepresenting. So I do recommend those, yeah. But I'm not sure there's a great deal that's written about the mythology of science. Bit of a provocative thesis. It's not really the mythology of science, it's the mythology of a type of science that calls itself science is now Darwinism. Science is a long-standing pedigree, and it has Christian origins as well. Modern science is begun largely by Christians, out of Christian principles, out of a conviction that it's right to worship God with our minds and to understand the world. It's a good thing to do that. So Christians are not opposed to science. This type of science that calls itself science and anything else that's not this is not science. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Yes?
This might slightly put you on the spot, but is there any way you could come up with a syllogism that would sum up your argument?
Oh, no.
I know it's hard.
Yeah, a syllogism. Oh, dear. No. Can I come up with a syllogism that... No, I cannot. On the spot. One of my colleagues in philosophy would probably be able to do that. Yes?
Just a comment.
Yes.
The National Academy of Science, for example, will say science has to be absent of supernatural. So they define science appropriate for them.
In a way that I've just agreed. So the National Academy of Science defines science as something that precludes the supernatural. Right. And by precluding the supernatural, they are probably thinking that they are preventing it from becoming a religious thing. I just think that that's not true, because most religions are not actually supernatural. They don't depend on it at all. Things that we call religions. World religions don't actually appeal to the supernatural. Certainly not, or if the supernatural, not the sense of a transcendent deity the way Christianity does. So they're trying to say we're not going to be involved in that. I don't think that they are involved in the same subject areas, if not. And I think invariably we incline in that direction. Anyway, good comment. Yes?
The poem by...
Keats?
Yes, by Keats. It reminded me of, I believe there were some similar ideas, possibly in ancient Greece, like I thought of Scala Naturalia, is that...
Yes.
Did I say that right? Is that linked? And,
well, the doctrine, so the theory of evolution is there in the ancient world, and the cosmogonies that are I know a bit about this topic, the cosmogonies of the ancient world, whether in Greek or Egyptian or any of the mythologies, they always account for the origin of the gods and how things evolve. Evolution is an ancient theory. It's not a modern invention. And it always begins in chaos, though. And that's their explanation for why things change, is because it began in chaos, and so it reverts back to chaos. So its basic principle, well, there may be a semblance of order for a time, but eventually it's going to collapse. Because the basic nature of reality, its basic principle is chaos. The basic principle of Christianity is God, so things are ruled by God. The basic principle of Darwinism is chaos, so everything's chaotic. Yes?
Do you think that might feed into some like political type theories?
Oh gosh,
like
yes.
Anarchy and
Oh yeah.
revolution producing, utopic governments?
For sure. So anarchism emerges in the mid-19th century as a movement. And the writing that they appeal to is written by a romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Queen Mab, it's one of the poems that inspired the radical anarchists as they began in the mid-19th century, right out of that, yeah. So it's a principle, it's a belief that the fundamental principle of reality is chaos, and that order is there as a means of keeping people in power, but it's disrupting the fundamental chaos, and it's better if things are chaotic than a superstructure, the appearance, the semblance of order, which is not real order. It's just a pseudo-order. So let's burn everything to the ground. Yes, at the back.
I just wondered if there was a response to pseudoscience. If somebody, like, there's different types of studies. So, like, say, paranormal and UFO, you categorize that as something that would be pseudoscience. And if you study science, you have to believe all of it because it's all science and along those lines.
So you talked about UFOs and the paranormal, and is there something to be said about them as pseudoscience? I don't quite understand the question. That's
Like certain systems out there categorize them as pseudoscience.
yes,
Categorize Christianity as pseudoscience.
yes.
So, how are you supposed to think about
Distinguish the two?
Yeah.
Well, so the question is, how do I distinguish belief in UFOs and the paranormal and that sort of thing, which tends to be called pseudoscience, from Christianity, which is also called pseudoscience by some? Well, you could talk about the basic pedigree of Christianity in advancing science, which is an empiric, this is a historic legacy, and there is no such legacy with studies in the UFOs of the paranormal. So just being unpopular or being mocked by the political powers that be is not sufficient reason to discount it as science. I think Christianity has a long history of science, and I think Christians are committed to science. And that is again, a historic fact. So that's the first thing I would say about it. But Christians are committed to understanding and loving God with our minds, and believe that there's something to be understood there. See, the reason that many cultures have never advanced the scientific culture is because they don't believe that nature can be understood in its principles. It can't be understood. And even if it could be, they ought not to, because there's something sacred about nature, and they shouldn't do that. But Christianity believes not only can it be understood, that it's right to understand it, and we ought to advance our understanding of the world for God's glory. There's also an understanding, though, in Christianity, that there's a danger with that, because there is a power that comes with it, and power can be misused. But I mean, the comparison of UFOs to Christianity, I think this is just a cheap slur, and I just don't even see any resemblance other than the slur. Yeah. 1 minute, one more question? Last one. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Did the theory of evolution become the religion of evolution, or was it a gradual progression like the
So the idea of evolution, I believe its early origins lie in the middle of the Enlightenment. The scientific theory is Darwin's Origin of the Species. We peg it to that. But the mythology around it and the idea that human origins begin in animals and grunts and cries, and that there's a progressive, we move from the dark ages and onwards and up to science, age of belief and then into the age of science. This is an Enlightenment account of history. And I think it's an evolutionary account, implicit or explicit. I think it's there. In the seeds of that, an Enlightenment writer at the same time as the Marquis de Sade. There's a recognition, there's an attempt to have a human explanation for all of human history, which is accompanied by people saying that actually what you call rational is merely the habits of people, and it's not really sadism, it's my expression of love. So the Marquis de Sade emerges at the same time. I think it is an Enlightenment myth, actually. And it's a reversion back to a pre-Christian view of life, namely evolution, that was there in the ancient world. Christianity was decisive in seeing history as having a linear characteristic and an eschatological one. So it had a fixed beginning, ex nihilo. It was going in a particular direction, and ultimately there would, at the cross, it was transformed, and there would be a consummation at the end of history. But in early history, the Greek histories, or any of the other histories of the ancient world, there was a cyclical, eternal recurrence, the circle of life, Lion King stuff. Yeah. That's an ancient theory of history. Things rise, they fall, they go back, there's no change. Change is constant, and change means that no progress is possible. Fatalism comes with that. So fatalism is a doctrine of the ancient world. The Greek philosophers found this unacceptable. But it was Christianity that changed the trajectory of history. The Enlightenment is living off the fumes of good Christian science, and we are living at the end of that age. Thank you.